Hello and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Red Planet by Robert Heinlein. Our heroes, Jim and Frank, have been sleeping away the bitter, cold Martian night deep in the middle of a giant Martian cabbage. I'm not the one who made this up. Anyway, that's where they are. Chapter 7 Pursued. Tiny Phobos, inner moon of Mars, came out of eclipse and, at breakneck speed, flew west to east into the face of the rising sun. The leisurely spin of its ruddy primary, 24.5 hours for each rotation, presently brought the rays of that sun to East Strymon, then across the broad desert between the twin canals and to the banks of West Strymon. The rays struck a great ball perched near the eastern bank of that canal, a desert cabbage closed against the cold. The plant stirred and unfolded. The sunward half of the plant opened flat to the ground, the other half fanned itself open like a spread peacock's tail to catch the almost horizontal rays. In doing so, it spilled something out of its heart and onto the flat portion. Two human bodies, twisted and stiff, clad garishly in elastic suits and grotesque helmets. A tiny ball spilled out with them, rolled a few yards over the thick green leaves, and stopped. It extended eye stalks and little bumps of legs and waddled back to the sprawled bodies. It nuzzled against one. It hesitated, nuzzled again, then settled back and let out a thin wailing in which was compounded inconsolable grief and an utter sense of loss. Jim opened one bloodshot eye. "Cut out that infernal racket," he said crossly. Willis shrieked, "Jim boy!" and jumped upon his stomach, where he continued to bounce up and down in an ecstasy of greeting. Jim brushed him off, then gathered him up in one arm. "Calm down. Behave yourself. Ouch! What's the matter, Jim boy? My arm's stiff. Ooh, ouch!" Further efforts had shown Jim that his legs were stiff as well, also his back and his neck. "What's the matter with you?" demanded Frank. "Stiff as a board. I'd do better to skate on my hands today. Say." "Say what?" "Maybe we don't skate. I wonder if the spring floods have started." "Huh? What are you gibbering about?" Frank sat up slowly and carefully. "Why, the spring floods, of course. Somehow we lasted through the winter, though I don't know how. Now we—" "Don't be any sillier than you have to be. Look where the sun is rising." Jim looked. Martian colonials are more acutely aware of the apparent movements of the sun than any earthbound men except possibly the Eskimos. All he said was, "Oh," and then, "I guess it was a dream." "Either that or you are even nuttier than usual. Let's get going." Frank struggled to his feet with a groan. "How do you feel?" "Like my own grandfather." "I mean, how's your throat?" Jim persisted. "Oh, it's all right." Frank promptly contradicted himself by a fit of coughing. By great effort, he controlled it shortly. Coughing while wearing a respirator is a bad idea. Sneezing is worse. "Want some breakfast?" "I'm not hungry now," Frank answered. "Let's find a shelter first so we can eat in comfort." "Okay." Jim stuffed Willis back into the bag, discovered by experiment that he could stand and walk. Noticing the flashlight, he tucked it in with Willis and followed Frank toward the bank. The canal vegetation was beginning to show. Even as they walked, the footing grew more tangled. The green plants, still stiff with night cold, could not draw away quickly as they brushed through them. They reached the bank. "The ramp must be about 100 yards off to the right," Frank decided. "Yep, I see it. Come on." Jim grabbed his arm and drew him back. "'Smatter?" demanded Frank. "Look up on the canal, north." "Huh? Oh." The scooter was proceeding toward them. Instead of the 250 miles per hour or more that such craft usually make, this one throttled down to a minimum. Two men were seated on top of it, out in the open. Frank drew back hastily. "Good boy, Jim," he approved. "I was just about to walk right into them. I guess we'd better let them get well ahead." "Willis, good boy, too," Willis put in smugly. "Let them get ahead my foot," Jim answered. "Can't you see what they're doing?" "Huh?" "They're following our tracks." Frank looked startled but did not answer. He peered cautiously out. "Look out," Jim snapped. "He's got binoculars." Frank ducked back. But he had seen enough. The scooter had stopped at approximately the spot where they had stopped the night before. One of the men on top was gesturing through the observation dome at the driver and pointing to the ramp. Canal ice was, of course, never cleaned of skate marks. The surface was renewed from time to time by midday thaws until the dead freeze of winter set in. However, it was unlikely that anyone but the two boys had skated over this stretch of ice so far from any settlement any time in months. The ice held scooter tracks, to be sure, but like all skaters, Jim and Frank had avoided them in favor of untouched ice. Now their unmistakable spoor lay ready for anyone to read from Cinia Station to the ramp near them. If we head back into the bushes, Jim whispered, we can hide until they go away. They'll never find us in this stuff. Suppose they don't go away. Do you want to spend another night in the cabbage? They're bound to go away eventually. Sure, but not soon enough. They know we went up the ramp. They'll stay and they'll search longer than we can hold out. They can afford to. They've got a base. Well, what do? We head south along the bank on foot, at least as far as the next ramp. Let's get going then. They'll be up the ramp in no time. With Frank in the lead, they dog-trotted to the south. The plants along the bank were high enough now to permit them to go under. Frank held a course about 30 feet in from the bank. The gloom under the spreading leaves and the stems of the plants themselves protected them from any distant observation. Jim kept an eye out for snake worms and water seekers and cautioned Willis to do likewise. They made fair time. After a few minutes, Frank stopped, motioned for silence, and they both listened. All that Jim could hear was Frank's raspy breath. If they were being pursued, the pursuers were not close. They were at least 2 miles south of the ramp when Frank stopped very suddenly. Jim bumped into him, and the two almost tumbled into the thing that had caused Frank to stop another canal. This one ran east and west and was a much narrower branch of the main canal. There were several such between Cinia and Charax. Some of them joined the east and west legs of Strymon Canal, some merely carried water to local depressions in the desert plateau. Jim stared down into the deep, narrow gash. For the love of Mike, we nearly took a header. Frank did not answer. He sank down to his knees, then sat and held his head. Suddenly he was overcome by a spasm of coughing. When it was over, his shoulders still shook as if he were racked by dry sobs. Jim put a hand on his arm. You're pretty sick, aren't you, fella? Frank did not answer. Willis said, poor Frank boy, and tut-tutted. Jim stared again at the canal, his forehead wrinkled. Presently, Frank raised his head and said, I'm all right. It just got me for a moment, running into the canal and all, and realizing it had us stopped. I was so tired. Jim said, look here, Frank, I've got a new plan. I'm going to follow this ditch off to the east until I find some way to get down into it. You're going to go back and give yourself up. No! Wait till I finish. This makes sense. You're too sick to keep going. If you stay out here, you're going to die. You might as well admit it. Somebody's got to get the word to our folks, me. You go back, surrender, and then give them a song and dance about how I went that away, anyway but this way. If you make it good, you can stall them and keep them chasing their tails for a full day and give me that much head start. In the meantime, you lie around in the scooter, warm and safe, and tonight you're in bed in the infirmary at school. There, doesn't that make sense? No. Why not? You're just being stubborn. No, repeated Frank. It's no good. In the first place, I won't turn myself over to them. I'd rather die out here. Nuts. Nuts yourself. In the second place, a day's start will do you no good. Once they're sure you aren't where I say you are, they'll just go back to combing the canal by scooter. They'll pick you up tomorrow. But, well, what's the answer then? I don't know, but it's not that. He was seized again by coughing. Neither of them said anything for several minutes. At last, Jim said, what kind of scooter was it? The usual cargo sort, a Hudson 600, I think. Why? Could it turn around on that ice down there? Frank looked down into the small canal. Its sides sloped in toward the bottom. The water level was so low that the ice surface was barely 20 feet across. Not a chance, he answered. Then they won't try to search this branch by scooter, at least not in that scooter. I'm way ahead of you, put in Frank. You figure we'll cross to East Strymon and go home that way. But how do you know this cut runs all the way through? You remember the map that well? No, I don't. but there is a good chance it does. If it doesn't, it will run most of the way across and we'll just have to hoof it the rest of the way. After we get to the east leg, it will still be 500 miles or so to Charax. This leg has shelters on it, even if we did miss the one last night. We've got just as good a chance of finding project shelters on East Leg as on West Leg, Jim answered. The project starts next spring on both sides. I know, Dad's talked about it enough. Anyhow, we can't use this leg any further. They're searching it. So why beat your choppers about it? The real question is, can you skate? If you can't, I still say you ought to surrender. Frank stood up. I'll skate, he said grimly. Come on. They went boldly along the stone embankment, convinced that their pursuers were still searching the neighborhood of the ramp. They were 3 or 4 miles further east when they came to a ramp leading down to the ice. Shall we chance it? Asked Jim. Sure, even if they send a man in on skates, I doubt if he would come this far with no tracks to lead him on. I'm tired of walking. They went down, put on their skates, and started. Most of the kinks from their uncomfortable night had been smoothed out by walking. It felt good to be on the ice again. Jim let Frank set the pace. Despite his illness, he stroked right into it and pushed the miles behind. They had come perhaps 40 miles when the banks began to be noticeably lower. Jim, seeing this, got a sick feeling that the little canal was not cross-connecting from west to east, but merely a feeder to a low spot in the desert. He kept this suspicion to himself. At the end of the next hour, it was no longer necessary to spare his chum. The truth was evident to both of them. The banks were now so low that they could see over them, and the ice ahead no longer disappeared into the blue sky, but dead-ended in some fashion. They came to the dead end presently, a frozen swamp. The banks were gone. The rough ice spread out in all directions and was bordered in the distance by green plants. Here and there, canal grass, caught by the freeze, stuck up in dead tufts through the ice. They continued east, skating where they could and picking their way around bits of higher ground. At last, Frank said, All out, end of the line, and sat down to take off his skates. I'm sorry, Frank. About what? We'll leg it the rest of the way. It can't be so many miles. They set out through the surrounding greenery, walking just fast enough to let the plants draw out of their way. The vegetation that surrounded the marsh was lower than the canal plants, hardly shoulder high, and showed smaller leaves. After a couple of miles of this, they found themselves out on the sand dunes. The shifting red iron oxide sands made hard walking, and the dunes, to be climbed or skirted, made it worse. Jim usually elected to climb them even if Frank went around. He was looking for a dark green line against the horizon that would mark East Strymon. It continued to disappoint him. Willis insisted on getting down. First, he gave himself a dust bath in the clean sand. Thereafter, he kept somewhat ahead of Jim, exploring this way and that and startling the spin bugs. Jim had just topped a dune and was starting down the other side when he heard an agonized squeak from Willis. He looked around. Frank was just coming around the end of the dune, and Willis was with him. That is to say, Willis had skittered on ahead. Now the bouncer was standing dead still. Frank apparently had noticed nothing. He was dragging along in a listless fashion, his head down. Charging straight at them was a water seeker. It was a long shot, even for a match marksman. The scene took on a curious unreality to Jim. It seemed as if Frank were frozen in his tracks, and as if the water seeker itself were strolling slowly toward his victims. Jim himself seemed to have all the time in the world to draw, take a steady, careful bead, and let go his first charge. It burned the creature, but it kept coming. Jim sighted on it again, held the stud down. His beam held steadily on the center line of the varmint, sliced it in two as if it had run into a buzz saw. It kept coming until its two halves were no longer joined, until they fell two ways, twitching. The great scimitar claw on the left had stopped within inches of Willis. Jim ran down the dune. Frank, no longer a statue, actually had stopped. He was standing, blinking at what had been a moment before the incarnation of sudden and bloody death. He looked around as Jim came up. Thanks, he said. Jim did not answer, but kicked at a trembling leg of the beast. The filthy thing, he said intensely. Gosh, how I hate them. I could burn every one of them on Mars all at once. He walked carefully up along the body, located the egg sac, and carefully blasted every bit of it. Willis had not moved. He was sobbing quietly. Jim came back, picked him up, and popped him into the travel bag. "Let's stick together from here on," he said. "If you don't feel like climbing, I'll go around." "Okay." "Frank?" Yes, what is it, Jim?" Frank's voice was listless. "What do you see ahead?" "Ahead?" Frank tried manfully to make his eyes focus, to chase the fuzz from them. It's the canal, the green belt, I mean. I guess we made it." "And what else? Do you see a tower?" "What? Where? Oh, there. Yes, I guess I do. It's a tower, all right. Well, for heaven's sake, don't you know what that means? Martians." "Yeah, I suppose so. Well, show some enthusiasm." "Why should I? They'll take us in, man. Martians are good people. You'll have a warm place to rest before we go on." Frank looked a bit more interested, but said nothing. "They might even know Gecko," Jim went on. "This is a real break." Maybe so. It took another hour of foot slogging before the little Martian town was reached. It was so small that it boasted only one tower, but to Jim it was even more beautiful than Syrtis Major. They followed its wall and presently found a gate. They had not been inside more than a few minutes when Jim's hopes, so high, were almost as low as they could be. Even before he saw the weed choked central garden, the empty walls and the silent courts had told him the bad truth. The little town was deserted. Mars must once have held a larger native population than it does today. Ghost cities are not unknown, and even the greater centers of population, such as Charax, Syrtis Major and Minor, and Hesperidium, have areas which are no longer used and through which tourists from Earth may sometimes be conducted. The little town, apparently never of great importance, might have been abandoned before Noah laid the keel of his ship. Jim paused in the plaza, unwilling to speak. Frank stopped and sat down on a metal slab, its burnished face bright with characters that an earthly scholar would have given an arm to read. "Well," said Jim, "rest a bit. Then I guess we better find a way to get down onto the canal." Frank answered dully, "Not for me. I've come as far as I can." "Don't talk that way. I'm telling you, Jim, that's how it is." Jim puzzled at it. "I'll tell you what, I'll search around. These places are always honeycombed underneath. I'll find a place for us to hole up overnight." "Just as you like." "You just stay here." He started to leave, then suddenly became aware that Willis was not with him. He then recalled that the bouncer had jumped down when they entered the city. "Willis! Where's Willis?" "How would I know? I've got to find him. Oh, Willis! Hey, Willis, come on, boy!" His voice echoed around the dead square. "Hi, Jim." It was Willis, rightly enough, his voice reaching Jim from some distance. Presently he came into sight, but he was not alone. He was being carried by a Martian. The Martian came near them, dropped his third leg, and leaned down. His voice boomed gently at Jim. "What's he saying, Frank?" "Huh? Oh, I don't know. Tell him to go away." The Martian spoke again. Jim abandoned the attempt to use Frank as a translator and concentrated on trying to understand. He spotted the question symbol in the inverted position. The remark was an invitation or a suggestion of some sort. Following it was the operator of motion, coupled with some radical that meant nothing to Jim. He answered it with the question symbol alone, hoping the native would repeat himself. Willis answered instead. "Come along, Jim boy, fine place." "Why not?" he said to himself, and answered, "Okay, Willis." To the Martian he replied with the symbol of great assent, racking his throat to produce the unearthly triple guttural required. The Martian repeated it, inverted, then picked up the leg closest to them and walked rapidly away without turning around. He had gone about 25 yards when he seemed to notice he was not being followed. He backed up just as rapidly and used the general inquiry symbol in the sense of "what's wrong?" "Willis," Jim said urgently, "I want him to carry Frank." "Carry Frank, boy?" "Yes, the way Gecko carried him." "Gecko not here. This Kambooch." "His name is Kambooch?" "Sure, Kambooch," Willis agreed, correcting Jim's pronunciation. "Well, I want Kambooch to carry Frank like Gecko carried him." Willis and the Martian mooed and croaked at each other for a moment. Then Willis said, Kombuch wants to know, does Jimboy know Gecko? Tell him we are friends, water friends. Willis already tell him. How about Frank? But it appeared that Willis had already told his new acquaintance about that too, for Kombuch enclosed Frank in two palm flaps and lifted him up. Frank opened his eyes, then closed them. He seemed indifferent to what was happening to him. Jim trotted after the Martian, stopping only to grab up Frank's skates from where he had abandoned them on the metal slab. The Martian led him into a huge building that seemed even larger inside than out, so richly illuminated and glowing lights were the walls. The Martian did not tarry, but went directly into an archway in the far wall. It was a ramp tunnel entrance leading down. The Martians appear never to have invented stair steps, or more likely never needed them. The low surface gravity of Mars, only 38% that of Earth, permits the use of ramps which would be disastrously steep on Earth. The Martian led Jim down a long sequence of these rapid descents. Presently, Jim discovered, as he had once before under Cinia City, that the air pressure had increased. He raised his mask with a feeling of great relief. He had not had it off for more than 24 hours. The change in pressure had come abruptly. He knew from this that it had not resulted from descent alone, nor had they come deep enough to make any great difference in pressure. Jim wondered how the trick was accomplished. He decided that it had pressure locks beat all hollow. They left the ramps and entered a large domed chamber, evenly lighted from the ceiling itself. Its walls were a continuous series of archways. Kombuch stopped and spoke again to Jim, another inquiry in which he used the name Gecko. Jim reached into his memory and carefully phrased a simple declaration. Gecko and I have shared water. We are friends. The Martian seemed satisfied. He led the way into one of the side rooms and placed Frank gently on the floor. The door closed behind them, sliding silently into place. It was a smallish room for Martians and contained several resting frames. Kombuch arranged his ungainly figure on one of them. Suddenly, Jim felt heavy and sat down rather unexpectedly on the floor. The feeling persisted, and with it a slight giddiness. He stayed seated. You all right, Frank? He asked. Frank muttered something. His breathing seemed labored and rough. Jim took off Frank's mask and touched his face. It was hot. There was nothing that he could do for Frank at the moment. The heavy feeling continued. The Martian did not seem disposed to talk, and Jim did not feel up to attempting a conversation in the dominant tongue in any case. Willis had withdrawn into a ball. Jim lay down beside Frank, closed his eyes, and tried not to think. He felt a moment of lightness, almost of vertigo, then felt heavy again and wondered what he was coming down with. He lay still for a few minutes, to be disturbed presently by the native bending over him and speaking. He sat up and discovered that he felt fine again. Kombuch scooped up Frank and they left the room. The great domed chamber outside looked the same, except that it now held a crowd of Martians, 30 or more of them. When Kombuch and his two burdens, followed by Jim, came out of the archway, one of them separated himself from the group and stepped forward. He was rather short, as Martians go. Jim Marlowe, he stated, with the vocative symbol. Gecko, yelled Jim, echoed by Willis. Gecko bent over him. My friend, he boomed softly in his own tongue. My little crippled friend. He raised Jim up and carried him away, the other Martians retreating to make way. Gecko moved rapidly through a series of tunnels. Jim, looking back, could see that Kombuch and the rest of his party were close behind, so he let matters drift. Gecko turned presently into a medium-sized chamber and put Jim down. Frank was deposited by him. Frank blinked his eyes and said, Where are we? Jim looked around. The room held several resting frames set in a circle. The ceiling was domed and simulated the sky. On one wall, a canal flowed past in convincing miniature. Elsewhere on the curved wall was the silhouette of a Martian city, feathery towers floating in the air. Jim knew those towers, knew of what city they were the signature. Jim knew this room. It was the very room in which he had grown together with Gecko and his friends. Oh my gosh, Frank, we're back in Cinia. Huh? Frank sat up suddenly, glared around him, then lay back down and shut his eyes tightly. Jim did not know whether to laugh or cry. All that effort, all their striving to escape and get home, Frank's gallant refusal to give up in the face of sickness and body weariness, the night in the desert cabbage, and here they were, not 3 miles from Cinia Station. And we'll follow them on their Martian odyssey further next time.